There is a war between the rich and poor, a war between the man and the woman. There is a war between the ones who say there is a war and the ones who say that there isn't. Why don't you come on back to the war? That's right, get in it. Why don't you come on back to the war? It's just beginning.
Welcome, everyone. This is Michael Pelias, the host today for the 15th edition of Prosperity Marxism. We're joined today by a substitute co-host and a comrade of ours, Bruno Gulli, and we will be engaging the thought and the recent published book of Richard Gilman Opalski, the book entitled The Communism of Love. And just a couple of words about Richard. Richard is a professor of political theory and philosophy at the University of Illinois at Springfield. He's a longtime, fellow traveler to the Institute for Radical Imagination, as well as traveler, I think, of the new generation of autonomous forces from Italy, kind of an extension of their work, and we'll hopefully engage some of that today. And I do want to add that Richard has a piece coming in the forthcoming situations on his trips through China, in his teaching in China in the summer of 2018, called Critical Reflections on Capitalist China and Notes on the China Lectures, his China Lectures. And this is forthcoming in the new situations, hopefully in the next month, online with a print edition in September, October of 2021. So we really welcome Richard. I'm going to make just a couple of words about the book to begin with, but to me, it's a real pleasure to have Richard here and to go over what I consider to be an enormously ambitious and an incredible foray into early communist theories about love, but also a very original take on what a communism of love would look like. Of course, the subtext of this book is in the subtitle, An Inquiry into the Poverty of Exchange Value, which of course indicates that capitalist relations, capitalist social reproduction makes it almost impossible for us to love, to really love. And I think Richard explores this through many giants, of which a lot of our audience have read. The first chapter will engage the thought of Emmanuel Levinas, Simone Weil, Maurice Blanchot, and Paul Camet, who I had never read until I looked at Richard's work, and I thank him for introducing me to the work of Camet. Then Richard will go through a rereading and a rethinking of Plato's Symposium, and especially the relationship between love and war, love and fellowship, love and friendship. And he has some very interesting distinctions between pathological love and practical love too, in terms of, a kind of Kantian move behind the scenes here. And he goes through the Uranian love and the Pantheon love as well. And then we're going to go into a reading of the Grundrisse, and hopefully we'll have a very good dialogue with our comrade here today and co-host Bruno Gulli, whose expertise on the Grundrisse shows in his book, first book, The Labor of Fire. And I'm really looking forward to that conversation and that dialogue. And of course, then we'll engage some of the newer work that he indulges, and the transitional figure, which I consider a transitional figure for Richard in terms of his own work and where he's going at some levels, which is Erich Fromm, and how this brings us up to some contemporary thinking about love and the communism of love. So I'm going to turn it over. I mean, I'm really very much scratching the surface in this very brief introduction. So I'm going to let Richard give us a sense of the motivation of the book, also to give us a sense of, whom the audience may be for this book too, and what's really intended in terms of its dissemination, to use a, a deconstructionist term, a Derridian term, and also to kind of present the contents in the way he, sees it and how it unfolded in his mind, and then of course in the book form. So welcome, Richard. Thank you so much for being here, and we really look forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you both for the conversation. So I will say some things about the book, but the main event will be what happens after I present and introduce it, the conversation. In terms of the motivation to write the book, I have a somewhat long and possibly unfortunate tendency to be attracted to things that frighten me. So the first book I wrote was on Habermas, and I was terrified, and in some ways still am, of Habermas. And then when I was exploring French radical theory outside of any university curriculum and came upon Guy Debord, I couldn't understand what Debord was up to. I hadn't read Georg Lukács. I didn't know the sources that he was dealing with. And I was terrified of Debord. And so I wrote a book on Debord. So the prospect of thinking and writing about love seemed to me very scary. And actually, in the early stages of reading about love in the history of philosophy and a little bit less in political theory, it became increasingly frightening. And it's a fear that is shared by many people interested in politics, it turns out, who see love as a rather vaporous, amorphous, potentially ineffable concept that is best left to poets or theologians. So really, what drew me to the project was a certain intense fear in the exploration of its subject matter. It was not going to be a banal or boring undertaking. It was going to be intimidating and frightening and intense all the way through. So I just came to it that way. The motivations or the aims, maybe I can get to that a little bit later, but I do have certain audiences in mind for this work, very specific audiences that I hope take it up. So maybe I'll just at this point talk a little bit about the book in some general and then specific terms, what I'm doing in it, and more specifically, what are some of the arguments. So the Communism of Love explores the concept of love as an activity, as a powerful activity, as an aspiration, but also as a power that is often regarded as apolitical, that is often regarded even as anti-political, that is regarded as private, in fact, even as a private property. And as I said a moment ago, as ineffable. And there are many, many examples in various long histories of thinking about love as private, ineffable, apolitical, anti-political. But one sharp example we can grab from nearby philosophy is Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition in 1958, calling love the most powerful of all anti-political forces, and shortly thereafter, in 1962, Arendt wrote a letter to James Baldwin, warning Baldwin against thinking and speaking of love in relation to politics. She was not happy to see him do that. So Arendt is just one of many examples we could take up, but the book is in a sense, arguing against all such tendencies that, and interested in thinking through the social and the political dimensions of love, and also to confront the materiality of love, right? So as opposed to this concept of love as some immaterial, ineffable, private affair, um, to think of love as a material, in its terms of its materiality, and specifically as a communist relation in our lives. So one way I think it might be useful is to think of the project of this book in a similar way to Franco Berardi's The Soul at Work, where at the beginning of that book, Berardi said, why should we leave the concept of the soul only to theologians to discuss? Why should we leave it only to religion? What do communists and materialists have to say about the soul? Or what can they say about the soul? And so you could say, in a sense, that I'm trying to do the same thing with love. So the study of love that I undertake is grounded in philosophy, but also draws on a diverse field of sociological, political, and also psychoanalytic theory. And of course, like any study, particularly of this scope, there are many things not in it that could have gone in. I mean, the casualties are, it's like a syllabus for a class you want to teach, where it's just a field of casualties. You can only put on 15, but you want to put on 100. So one of the conversations that always encircles the book is, what about this and what about that? So to narrow down a little bit what was anchoring the bibliographical decisions I made, and also some of the normative decisions that I make in the book. One way to think of this book is as a critical development of Erich Fromm's theory of love, from where picking up where he left off in the middle of the 20th century. So as Michael rightly said, this is a major way of framing the project, is to think about how we can develop a theory of love after Fromm, following some of what I take to be his critical insights, which unfortunately many other critical theorists after Fromm neglected to take up, Axel Honneth and many others, in the way that he did. So following Fromm, I define love as an action, as something we do, not something we get or give, like a commodity. So love as an active relation, as an activity. And more specifically, I think of love as our active participation in the becoming of our beloved. So, I mean, one obvious example would be to think about, a friend or a child. The way that I participate in my son's becoming is an active is an activity of love. It's love in action. But we shouldn't only think about the beloved as a person, because people also participate in the society becoming something that it is not yet, something that it could become, that it should become. So love as an active participation in the becoming, in the other's becoming. Now, I should say here, which I think is maybe a good way of getting some of the argumentative underpinnings just out in the open, that what my critique of Fromm really is on three major points. The first is that Fromm, although he was a Marxist and a Freudian, when Fromm came to thinking about the problems he diagnosed in books like The Sane Society and The Art of Loving, he, in my view, was too optimistically conceived of psychoanalysis as praxis. So, he was thinking about the problems as a Marxist and a Freudian, but when he was thinking about solutions, he was thinking a bit too much as a Freudian and not enough as a Marxist, I would say. And it was a little bit frustrating in Fromm for me, because I know he was in close correspondence with people like Raya Dunayevskaya, Dunievskaya, who is in correspondence with Fromm and Marcuse. And Dunievskaya and Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse, were interested in social movements. They were interested in upheavals in the streets. They were interested in revolts. Dunievskaya, even more than Marcuse, was interested in Black revolt and women's revolts around the world. So she was, and so the emphasis on psychoanalysis as praxis is problematic. Another thing that I found in Fromm that needed to be done, and I tried to do it at least in a preliminary way in this book, is that Fromm talks, as many critical theorists of his generation did, too generically about love. There's a certain, in a way, you can't get too mad at him for something like this, but within the context of the critical theory of Fromm's generation, to speak of love in a very general and generic way, not recognizing sufficiently the different work love needs to do in different communities. If we look at racial stratifications, if we look at sexism, if we look at the kind of work that love does, or the demands on love in impoverished Black communities in the United States, it's different than it will be in other communities, or for communities of sexual minorities and so forth. So I have 1.5 chapters in this book that are trying to deal with, love in different contexts of racialization, sexualization. The third problem I found in Fromm that I try to deal with in this book is what I regard in Fromm to be a kind of anemic concept of socialism. If I can say that, I mean, Fromm was hanging out a little bit too much with David Reisman, I think, and he was a bit inclined to more liberal articulations of socialism from his generation. So, for example, his investment in the Socialist Party, Social Democratic Federation, the SPSDF, this type of socialism, from my point of view, is too far away from what I find to be most hopeful in the legacy of Marx. So now this leads a little bit to talking about communism and why communism. We could talk a little about love and Fromm, but why communism? Well, I approach communism first and foremost as a form of life, not as a form of government, although there are certainly implications for statecraft. I'll say something about that in a moment, but generally, I think we must begin thinking communism as a form of life. And by comparison to what Marx himself wrote about social and economic affairs, about exploitation, about everyday life, his attention to government was minor. In fact, many of my students who study Marx with me, often in pursuit of finding why they don't like Marx, they want to substantiate their already existing hatred of Marx, are frustrated because it's hard for them to find all of Marx's grand declarations about the form of government. So I think of communism, first of all, as a form of life, because I think the way I approach Marx is that he was carrying on a certain fixation that he found in Hegel. So when Marx was moving into his own thing and his own work, he was carrying on a certain fixation on the Gemeinwesen, right? The Gemeinwesen. So the nature of the community, how it is, how it could be, how it should be. And you can find Marx's interest in the Gemeinwesen from the early work, from the 1844 manuscripts through to the Grundrisse and elsewhere. Now, Marx wrote about naturally arisen communism, when in the Grundrisse, for example, he talks about the communist social relations and exchange relations only beginning at the borders of two communities. And then you look at early post-Marx, Marxists like Rosa Luxemburg. I mean, shortly after Marx, Rosa Luxemburg wrote a wonderful essay called The Dissolution of Primitive Communism. And in The Dissolution of Primitive Communism, Luxemburg studied communist forms of life in, first of all, what she found in the ancient German Mark communities, M-A-R-K, but then she found in around the world in a kind of global philosophical anthropological study, communist forms of life that were eventually broken apart by the early development of capitalism and slavery and so forth. So I think of communism this way as a form of life. Now it is worth pointing out that of course communism will implicate certain approaches in politics and policy and statecraft. The problem that I want to confront by talking about communism in the way that I do is the reduction of communism to its implications for policy, politics, and statecraft. Right. So, I mean, the book is published on AK Press, which is a very well-known anarchist press. And many anarchists, when they think communism, unfortunately, they think similar to what their right-wing enemies think. They think of a big oppressive government, and this needs to be confronted. We need to understand communism not as defined by our enemies, but as defined by communists in a very long and rich history. So, we won't get too much into this, but like when Eric Hobsbawm talked about the short 20th century, right, the Russian Revolution to the end of the Cold War, in this period, communism was vilified, was defined by its vilification as a form of government. And so a part of what I'm doing in all of my work is I'm trying to retrieve a broader sense of communism outside of the limitations of the Cold War discourse, which has made a somewhat surprising comeback. We have the famous definition of communism from Marx and Engels in the German ideology. The real movement to abolish the present state of things. But as communists, we always have to answer the question, what do we mean by the real movement? And what do we mean by the present state of things? Right? So we can say communism is the real movement that abolishes the present state of things, but we have to make concrete what are the real movements and what is the present state of things. So when we make those terms concrete, it's not just one thing, communism, but one thing that I think it must be is a movement to abolish a world of exchange relations, a world governed by the logic of capitalist exchange. One of the most powerful epiphanies, I think, that is to be found in Marx is the idea that there are many other values than exchange value. And this is why, when my mother would say to me, "Are you still playing jazz?" And I would say, "Yes." And she would say, "Well, but are they paying you?" And I would say, "No, people would pay me not to hear me play. The jazz I play, people would pay for me to stop, but it has a different value, right? It has what Marx called in the manifesto a personal value or a personal worth. There are other ways of relating than exchange relations." And Marx, of course, gave us an idea. He dreamt of a better Gemeinwesen. He juxtaposed one Gemeinwesen to another. And with the commitment, the ideal Gemeinwesen with this sort of horizontal commitment from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. So this hopeful horizon of Marx, I think, can be found in miniature in a lot of little islands of communism or little precarious communes that we create because we have to do it. So the way I relate to my children, I don't say to my sons, if you don't pay me, I won't feed you. I don't say to my kindergartner, if he doesn't do labor in the house, he's going to sleep outside on the street. Because the logic of exchange doesn't really have any business there, even though it goes into those spaces and it colonizes those spaces. People like Leopoldina Fortunati, who, and some of the feminist philosophers who focused on, were part of the Wages for Housework movement, they understood the colonization of the family by the logic of capital. In this book, I have a pretty extensive section on Alexandra Kollontai, who is thinking about family relations in relation to communism. But nonetheless, we still have some experience with other relations than capitalist exchange relations. A friend calls me up and says, I'm getting a divorce, I lost my job, I need your time and attention. And I don't say you can have it in exchange for $15 an hour. Because if I give my friend the friendship in exchange for $15 an hour, the friendship is immediately nullified. So that is a relation that is dissolved, in fact, abolished, obliterated by exchange relations. My friend gets a time and attention in exchange for nothing. It's absolutely necessary to the logic of friendship, which is not a capitalist logic. So I think love relations give us a kind of experience, direct experience with a communist aspiration that is in all of us. This is one of the frightening moments, is because schooled as I was in a lot of coursework and teaching and learning and postmodern theory, one must beware proclamations of the universal, but the aspiration to love may be as close as we can get to some kind of a universal communist aspiration. So part of the intention of the book is to address those who are interested in thinking about communism, because I want them to think about communism in a richer, broader way. But I also want people who are interested in love to understand or to think about what love really means, not to be put off by the fear, not to be prevented by the same trepidations that I would share about daring to speak of love. So these love relations where we experience, other social relations that are not abiding by capitalist exchange relations, these could perhaps be micro-political, as Felix Guattari may have called them. But Guattari also, when he was thinking about micro-revolutionary and micro-political social relations, when in the late 70s, thinking about autonomous social and political upheavals in Italy, he asked in an essay, The Proliferation of the Margins, he asked, will all these micro revolutions finally initiate a real revolution? And it was an open question, because he was sure there would be in the late 70s, he felt sure there would be no more October revolutions, but that revolution was still on the table, hopefully, but it was an open question. So now we are living in a different time, and I'm trying to find other locations from which to think about these sort of micro-political, micro-revolutionary conditions of life that we could perhaps learn from. And the love relation of two or more people in a family is not the only place where we find the work of love. Many people have to flee from the home and the family to find love, because the home is often a space of abuse. And now, in a time of COVID-19 and the global pandemic, we have seen around the world victims quarantined with their abusers in horrific private nightmares that we will be learning about for the rest of our lives. We'll be hearing these stories. So many people, and Bell Hooks and others who've written about love have been very good about pointing out that many people have to flee the home to find love relations. And so we have to also look in other locations outside of the family, outside of the friendship. And so we can find people who go off in search of others with whom to make common cause, also in the streets, in social movements and uprisings, revolts. And so someone like George Katsiafikis, he's elaborated on this point pretty well. Katsiofikis, following Herbert Marcuse, writes a lot about the eros effect and the activity of love in global social movements. Right. So Katsiofikis is interested in that. He's interested in finding love outside of the family in global uprisings and social movements. But he doesn't think about communism in relation to love in that way. He thinks about love in the upheaval vis-a-vis the eros effect and Herbert Marcuse. And also I find that we have to be careful because we don't know if the experience of love will lead to anything outside of the experience itself. And this is one of the open questions of the book is how can we make it from the communism we know to some other communization, if you will, a word of recent interest, communization. How can we think communization out of the precarious communes of our already existing love relations? So it's not easy to answer that question, but just to draw to a close here, as a critical theorist, I want to appreciate in this book the importance of an epiphany. The importance of an epiphany should not be taken for granted. Okay, I think the importance of an epiphany is great because it impacts how we understand ourselves and our relation to others and the world around us. And sometimes this is the great hope of any philosophical endeavor, is the generation of an epiphanous moment, right? And some philosophers will, perhaps not like to reduce their project to that. But I often think that the best project aims for an epiphany or a single epiphanous moment. But I also think that some of the best epiphanies do not come through theoretical work, philosophical work. I think some of the best epiphanies come not through texts and speech, but through collective actions. People who've been writing about white supremacy for decades, for recent decades, could not have hoped for a better accomplice to the hopeful epiphany than the uprisings of Black Lives Matter. A book that I wrote before the Communism of Love was called Spectres of Revolt. The subtitle of that book was Philosophy from Below, the Intellect of Insurrection. So sometimes the epiphany comes from elsewhere. So in that spirit, I'm now looking at the epiphanies in other spaces, not so much as I was thinking when I was working on Spectres of Revolt about the Arab Spring, about Syriza, about the Greek revolts, about Black Lives Matter after Ferguson and Baltimore. I'm thinking now about other locations in the materiality of our love relations. And what I want to ask is, are we aware of the secret communism of an aspiration we share? Are we aware of a secret communism of our own communist aspiration? Why is it important to think about the communism of the relationships that make our lives matter, that give our lives meaning? Why is it important to think about the communism inside of the precarious communes we either have in a family or we have to find elsewhere because the family is a space of abuse? It's important because it puts us in touch with a communism in striking distance, with a materiality of a communist form of life that gives us a real refuge from, if we are fortunate, a real living alternative to a life that is otherwise governed by capital. And my great hope is that when people take up this book now, in the context of a pandemic, in the context of being locked up either in a precarious commune or in a horrific situation that makes you need to flee for one, if you can even manage it, that we can see the importance of the materiality of this other relationality. all right, that this love relationality that is a part of the human aspiration, we have to, I think, understand that it is antagonistically related to the logic of capital. This is the political project of the work. This is the political project. And the claim is, finally now, that if we don't think about the communism of love, if we don't think about the communism of love, it is only because we do not think enough about love, which many communists do not like to do. You know, as this pandemic was hitting, I was in Argentina, scheduled to give a talk on this book in a Marxist center, and I was unable to do it. I was there, but they banned U.S. citizens from the universities very, very wisely, and they had to cancel the seminar. But my host there in the Marxist Center, this was in La Plata, Argentina. He said, many of our comrades want to know why you would speak of love. You know, I mean, Enrique Dussel, you know, he will speak of love, but he is also thinking of God. And he's thinking also, you know, about theology. But we want to know why you would speak of love. It's almost funny for many like us, many communists like us, to think of love. But I think we have to do it. And because I think that we need to understand what this aspiration is. And also, I think we should better understand what communism means. So I will leave it there.
Thank you so much for that very detailed and very interesting approach to your book through your own ambitions and desire for this book and the audience. I'm just going to make a couple of very short comments on what you said, you know, just in terms of elucidation for our audience too here. First of all, I do want to say that Hannah Arendt wrote her dissertation on love with Martin Heidegger. Love and St. Augustine. So that's the irony of all of this, with Arendt trying to work backwards to tell James Baldwin, please don't put it out there as a public affair, so to speak, right? So this is interesting too. And what you began with, private property, certainly this is the Kantian notion of marriage, and in some ways his notion of love too happens to be possession, right? Possession of the other's genitals was a definition of marriage for Kant, you know, the union, if you will, and the notion of the enlightened person. And of course, one thing that is interesting about that period, the period of the Enlightenment, is of course the vindication for the rights of women, and of course the one lover man, if we can speak in jazz terms, William Godwin's work on, you know, during this period, as someone very free sexually, right? And you know, really a very early advocate of what was called free love back in the, you know, early 19th century, Mary Shelley's, of course, father. So I'd like to put that out. In terms of Erich Fromm, and this is the joke, he wrote Escape from Freedom in 1941, and the joke out there was an escape from Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, you know, his wife, right? So this is a kind of interesting play on, you know, the great thinker that you're taking your part of the writes a book, Escape from Freedom, which may have been the escape from his, you know, highly intelligent and fellow traveler wife. Anyway, I thought your introduction really great to the book. There's much to work with. I'm sorry we don't have 5 hours to go through this today, because certainly the material is there. I just want to say one thing. I want to go back to this later when we kind of wrap up. You know, you use this phrase, secret communism, and maybe a la Babeuf, we could talk about a new conspiracy, not of equals, but of lovers, right? Or a new conspiracy of love, which could kind of be interesting to talk about these micro, you know, communities that Felix Guattari spoke to, and, you know, that we're really not going to have global revolution. I mean, at least I hope we do, but but these micro communities are a very interesting way of going about this. And I think this was one of Guattari's great insights that kind of kept movement politics alive, despite there is no alternative of Thatcher and Reaganism, et cetera. This was a very important moment in the history of the left. And I'm really glad you brought that up. Very interesting. And then just one other note, and this is just for elucidatory purposes. The idea of the soul at work that you talked about, Barati, you bring back the notion of love and the soul at work. There were theologians such as Jean-Luc Marion, who a French philosopher who did speak of the soul and going back to that kind of language. And then Michel Henry wrote a piece called, and you probably know Michel Henry, a very good book on Marx and the body, spoke of, does the concept of the soul have any meaning? So this is another thing too, and I think your book is very good at basically explicating and laying the groundwork towards a redefinition, reconfiguration of love. So maybe I'll stop there with my few remarks and just say that chapter 1 has 3, maybe 4 heavyweights in it. And maybe we can start there, Bruno, with Simone Weil. And Blanchot. And please.
Right. I would actually start differently because of the great introduction. Thank you so much, Richard. And there is so much in the book and so much in your introduction that, I have, if I can, then I will go orderly through the various points that I wrote down. But otherwise, what I would really like to start with is that I like very much the word that you used, epiphany, and which is so important. And I like the fact that you use epiphany instead of event. And this is important, it seems to me, because within what you do with the book and what you said today in the presentation, I heard you speak also other times about the book, but the question is that love is not an event precisely because it is an activity, it is something that must be built, right? And yet, at the same time, very interestingly, right, it is already there, like the secret communism of love, in a sense. So, and the epiphany, that's what I like about it, because, it is that which, in a sense, shows itself by standing on itself, right? But it is a showing that, not necessarily in the sense of Heidegger, but it is already there. If anything, in the sense of, in which Marcuse in Essay on Liberation says, well, utopia is no longer the utopia that people thought of in the past, a place that doesn't exist. It is something which is blocked from coming into existence because of the powers of established societies. So it is already there. The question is how can, and it is very often, not let alone untheorized, but unrecognized as well. And yet it is there. And if I may say parenthetically, but an important parenthesis, I was going to say that later, but I say it now, it is certainly in each singularity, it is in the relationship between various singularities, it is also a cosmic power. I like to say that Dante ends his comedy, right, the Paradiso, the last book of his, with the last line is l'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle, which in English is the love, the moves, the star, the sun, and the other stars, right? So, and of course, this is in the Christian metaphysics, theology of Dante, but we can go back all the way to the materialist understanding of this in the Pre-Socratics, Empedocles, right? So, there is this love which can be read in many ways and which necessarily penetrates each singularity and makes the singularities what they are, because otherwise there wouldn't be even the possibility, otherwise we just had the individual, right? The skeleton of what's a life. I use a life, I'll go back to that, the expression that you use at the outset of your book, the skeleton of what a life could be. Not a singularity, but individuality. It must be filled, in a sense, penetrated by this law. Love, this is what I like. I mean, so that's why I wanted to call attention to the beautiful way in which you introduce this and the word you use, epiphany, and the secret communism. And I like to remark again on the fact that evidently, simply because by the mere fact that love is, and of course I completely agree with you, an activity is not an event. It's not just something that, it is not like falling in love, like being madly in love with someone. And it is not, you say that often in your book, contrary to other theorists, you say, including Badiou, right? Alain Badiou, there is this tendency of looking at love in the sense of romantic love. I mean, that's part of it too, but it is much more than that. So what is this building of, this making, this becoming, which, then I'll go back to this later and touch on what Michael was saying, Simone Weil. I mean, as you were speaking, Richard, I often saw the concepts of, probably you didn't mention the concepts of attention and care, but they were there in most of what you said, right? And it is precisely that. I mean, it is attention and care, which is an activity. It is an activity which is the same in a sense as love. Now, this activity, I mean, this is very interesting because it is not easy. In fact, I mean, the problem with people who say, oh, I wish I were in love and so on and so forth. No, it's not an easy thing. It's highly problematic. It's very difficult. I mean, I am also reminded of something that Jean-Paul Sartre says, that to love is to want to love. Wanting to love is to love. And you say, Richard, that in another, not with a reference to Sartre, but in another moment in your book. But this, and I don't want to, focus on the will, but the desire, but not simply a desire, like vague desire. It is a desire which also initiate a very serious task, an activity which goes not only with the person, the people we love, but with ourselves, the care of the self. I mean, we had to bring ourselves to the possibility of loving, becoming capable. I mean, although love is there and we have this capacity, but we have, in this sense, I like what Hannah Arendt says, then I'll go back to, I think that you mentioned that on page 242, and the letter she wrote to James Baldwin, but that is true too. This is an important aspect. I mean, we have the twofold, one may say, capacity to love, and I don't want to say to hate, because you made that point. It's not necessarily the opposite of love, hatred, but to love and not to love, right? I mean, deciding, so to speak, or having the preference for, and it's not simply a preference, again, left in a vague state. But really, what that means is that it has to become a constant and never-ending task for each one of us, right? It's work. That's what it is, work, right? The labor of love and so on. So, and I like.
Go ahead. Yeah. Okay.
No, if I may, because I mean, to call attention actually to the main idea in the book, which is in the introduction, but then you say that at least twice toward the end again, right? Which is, and I read, love is either a communist power or it is not, in fact, love. You say on page 3, and then at least again it comes back on page, I believe, 271 toward the end. If love is not communist, it is a false form of love. Very beautiful. I like this very much, although and maybe we go back to that. I have some questions about that. Problematic too. Maybe, right? Maybe we can go back to that. But this is very important. It is, and you say again on page 59, it is an irreducible or irreducibly communist power. And of course, this opens up the question of what really is love, what is communism. You were speaking about that before, and what is power as well. And the relation of all these things to care. right? Care, even hands-on care, but also caring in the more general sense. And I like to say also, because Michael and I were speaking about this on the phone and so on previously, and the question of Kant also, I may, and then maybe I want you to react, and then maybe I continue and touch on other points. But the question of, yeah, I mean, in a sense, your book can be read. I hope this is not reductive, as a radical take, let's say, on Kant's problematic but wonderful distinction between, as Michael was saying, pathological love, love based on sympathy. It's not pathological in the sense of sick, although it may get also to that when people say, I'm madly in love with you. You know, if someone tells you that, you say, stay away, you know, you don't want to deal with, you know. But even based on sympathy, I love this person because I know them, my brother, my sister, that's easy. But what he calls practical love, which is in a sense the same as universal love, which instead of sympathy, we can say includes empathy, perhaps, right? So, and your book seems to be, in a sense at least, a radical take on that. I mean, a way of looking at the possibility of growing into, of making oneself capable of loving, not in the sense that one is not capable from the beginning. The capacity is there, you know, let's say, even with Aristotle, it must be activated, right? I mean, it is an activation. Otherwise, it doesn't happen by itself. It's not like lightning and so on and so forth, right? I mean, something that takes over us, right? It is this activation which must become a habit and a constant one at the same time, right? So, I mean, this is these are some of the things that I want to say at this stage, but you know, I mean, the idea that
Go ahead,
ultimately,
Bruno. I'm going to interject though, but
oh,
please
okay,
continue. No, say what you have to say. I'm sorry, but I was
no,
going
no,
to.
no, okay, you can, I mean, I can go back later,
I
yes.
think one of the more powerful things, and we're going to have to engage this in Richard's book, is his definition. And since we're on this notion of the practical in Kant, that love is an action. It's an active relation, as you said, Bruno. Work, and I think one of Richard's great insights is that really it's an active participation. I really like this phrase, in the becoming of our beloved. This is a very interesting way. This is more than amour fou, right? More than mad love. Much more than the kind of thing we get from the surrealists, much more than we get from the romantic tradition. You know, you're really actively engaged in the organic development or whatever development is occurring in the beloved indeed. It is really a philosophy very much like Bloch's Not Yet. You know, you're in this process of the not yet, the to come, that really is out there. So I really like that about the book. And then the other thing is, and something that you and I have talked about too, Bruno, is this notion, and I think Richard is trying to really develop this. I don't know if it's fully developed. It's probably going to be the next book. This notion of community, especially in
Yeah.
Martin. The
Yeah,
right? This is a very, very important thing going forward. How do we get to this community of love, this community of lovers, and especially when we're still subjected, if you will, to exchange value? In fact, it's going to even get worse given the pandemic and what's going on. I mean, you know me, I like to read Finance Capital. I like to see the effects that are happening on people in everyday life that don't have a much longer vision like we do. You know, we stand somewhat like the Machiavellian prince, both at the foot of the mountain, but also on the mountain. We're in this double movement, this dual perspective always. We have an advantage this way. But for most people in everyday life, the effects that this is going to have, and how do we, in a sense, initiate, if you will, encourage a community such as this, you know, and what do we mean, and how would this be outside of the communes of the 60s. You know, I grew up in the 60s. We had the Love-Ins, the communes in Woodstock, you know, and speaking of epiphanies, you know, the Woodstock is one part of this. Of course, the movement of March 22nd that we're now, you know, celebrating this month at Vincennes, that kind of predicated the events of May of 68, which could be looked again as epiphanies instead of events. I like the way this is used, despite the religious overtones of the, you know, the Neo-Greek usage of epiphany and the Christian usage. So I think this is where we should go. I think this is a very important thing that you've brought up, and also the role, if you will, of a Marxist humanist like Fromm. Why would he, I mean, this is a question that I have, why would Fromm return to the psychoanalytic praxis, right, as a praxis, rather than what Richard is saying, because he does have the wherewithal to do so. You know, he has that background and he's in contact with people who, as Richard said, with Raya in Detroit and Herbert in California, or at that time I think was in Massachusetts. How do we understand this movement back? To my mind, it also has to do somewhat with, you know, the government interventions during a time and a climate in which a lot of these people began to write. You know, this was a period of McCarthyism. And, you know, in the United States, every time something comes back, right, of Marx, right, sometimes every time there's a movement that may be leading towards an epiphany or has the possibility of such a thing to overcome this exchange value, Freud returns with a vengeance, right? And it's not always the Freud of the praxis. It's not the Lacanian Freud. It's not the Deleuzian and Guattarian Freud. So this is, to me, a very crucial political question, to frame it in political terms too. And it's very interesting to me how you know, Fromm for you is a kind of turning point. So maybe we can discuss that along some community. And Bruno is brimming with ideas. We've discussed the book a lot. I don't want to, you know, I want him to continue with his thinking. Yes, please.
Yeah, because then I will say something about community too. But for now, maybe Richard, you want to.
Of course. Yeah. So I just wanted to throw out some of those.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I really love I want to repeat, I love the definition of love as action. I think this is really good. Love is a praxis, as you've said too, Bruno, as work and working through it in the psychoanalytic sense. But it's also this really lovely phrase that you have, the active participation in the becoming of the other. It's like a radical pact. It's no longer about the possession of a Kantian moment, right? Or the romantic notion of, you know, that I'm with you, or the Sartrean notion that most relationships are, you know how you define love. Love is two hypnotists going at each other.
Yeah, because if I may, before Richard, before you reply, and you say that in the book, and you said that in the introduction as well, in the relationship that you describe with your children, right? That in a sense, one might say, I mean, to love is really to want the freedom of the other, right? I mean, that the other may develop to the highest potential, right? And therefore the freedom of the other. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And not, which is the opposite of a possession, which, if I may, maybe we'll go back to this later. It might be also good at one point to touch on Taoism, right? Lao Tzu, Chuang Tzu, and also St. Francis.
Let's stay with this book, but we can touch on that.
Okay, hold on. I mean, St. Francis as well,
right,
speaking about the question of action and activity, because that's important as well. Yeah.
So we gave you a lot, huh?
Yeah, no, let me just start by saying that I could not have hoped for two finer interlocutors. I really appreciate the comradely, critical, and serious attention that you are giving to the work. It means a lot to me, and I really appreciate everything that you've said. And it's almost tempting just to not say anything and listen more. But let me say some things at least. You know, first, I don't think that it's an insulting reduction to think of some of the best things, not only in this book, but in others of mine and of others, as a kind of radicalization of Kant. I mean, one could say that one radicalization of Kant's cosmopolitanism is Marxian internationalism. In the final thesis of Guy Debord's The Society of the Spectacle, he says, communication needs to take up arms against the inverted truth of the existing world. And that's a radicalization of, the public use of reason. Kant doesn't have the public use of reason taking up arms, but Debord does. So when you think also of Kant, you can think about what he says in Theory and Practice about hospitality, and a certain radicalization of Kant's concept of hospitality, I think, is very much in line with what I am saying about love, particularly in the chapter where I deal with, global issues and borders with Zygmunt Bauman and others, particularly Ulrich Beck and Elizabeth Beck-Gernsheim. So I think this is right. Of course, the problem is that we can't really get these things from Kant without moving into a critique of capitalism and moving through some of the post-Kantian resources on thinking about political economy and revolution. So that's one thing I would say there. Another thing on Simone Weil and the not yet and attention, Bruno, which I really appreciate you bringing those points up. It was not an accident that the first chapter of the book, which is called The Logic of Love as a Communist Power, centers on three figures who are not themselves communists, or at least not easily recognizable as such. So Simone Weil, who was a critic of Marx, she was a Marxist early on. When she was very young, she was drawn to the struggles of workers and the theories of Marx. But she went to Spain in the 1930s. She threw down more closely with the anarchists in the last part of her life, and she actually wrote a very severe critique of Marx in her book on oppression and liberation. And Maurice Blanchot was, for a long time, I wouldn't necessarily say an anti-communist, but he was pretty conservative. And
well, for the record, I just want to say about Blanchot, if I can interrupt for a second, he was a traveling member of Action Française. Blanchot was tainted very much during Vichy and pre-Vichy, in a way. Furthest thing away from being on the left.
Very far away from being on the left, but one of the things that helped him out was his ability to think about May, June 1968.
Absolutely.
His openness to thinking about it. And I was stunned when I opened up The Unavowable Community, a wonderful short book on the concept of community by Blanchot, to find that the first chapter in part 2 was called The Community of Lovers. And it was about the uprising of May, June 68.
Absolutely.
So what I'm doing when I'm thinking there in the first chapter with Levinas, Blanchot, and Weil is I'm trying to identify that even among those who are not thinking about communism, not committed to a communist project per se, and those who are not thinking about the communism of love, nonetheless, when they think of love, they think about the kinds of things that we communists must think of, right? That their concept of love, I also think the three of them happen to think very well about love. And it's very resonant with what I understand to be a less anemic and better than Fromm's approach to the idea of communism and social change and so forth. Now, Weil's beautiful line, Simone Weil's beautiful line that the rarest form of generosity is attention. Very beautiful, poetic line, where she talks about attending to the other, and particularly in Gravity and Grace and other texts in her fully, Christian mystical phase of life. They talks about attending to the frailty of the other. And I think there of from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. And human frailty differs. There are people in different positions in life, in the material conditions of life. And what love does actively, when we love a person with a disability, when we love a person who has a particular location within the material conditions of life, is we go to their frailty and we attend to their frailty from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. So I do think that there is an irreducible communism of love, Bruno, and I think it is problematic, particularly if one has an overdetermined, an overly narrow definition of the concept of communism. But when we think communism through Marx, through his Hegelian fixation, if we can call it that, on the Gemeinwesen and the naturally arisen communism and forms of life, I do think there's always an irreducible communism to love. Now, obviously, the political side of that, if we think politics, is that we are surrounded by people who want nothing of communism, but something of love. Everywhere you look on the planet, differently defined as it may be, many people want nothing of communism, or so they say. But they want something, and quite a bit, from love. So the political side is to see the irreducible communism of love is to put us in touch with one of the many limits of capital, okay? Which is something that I think we can approach through our experiences with other people in the world. One other thing I would say about, in relation, Bruno, to your wonderful book on Singularities at the Threshold, the Ontology of Unrest, which I really thoroughly enjoyed. I think it's a very important counteraction to a still prevalent discourse on neoliberal individuality, is that singularity, as you discuss it in that book, emerges not on its own inside of the individual as such, but is that singularity is, in a certain sense, produced, right, by the relations that surround persons. So no person is really, every singularity is connected within a web of social relations to others who participate in their becoming. So when you made that point earlier about for the future freedom, absolutely, this is true. I want my sons, I want to participate in their becoming what they are not yet, but I also want to participate in a particular becoming, which is to say a becoming which includes a certain freedom or autonomy that they do not yet have from me. Okay, so I want them to have, but that is a singularity that is a part of the production of a certain network of social relations. So we have, in some way, I would put it this way, different ways of thinking about the same subject matter, and it is, for me, as you know from my book, also an ontological question. Because when I think of love as an activity, I think of becoming, which is not very far away of to be, or what it means to be. So there is a certain ontological component to this project, which I think you are right to think of also Sartre, because it is about what it means to be. One last oh, two things I have noted here. One is about the point that love is not an opposite to hatred. One of the other things I'd like this book to do is to counteract a liberal tendency to think of hate and love as opposites, which has unfortunately been one of the problematic legacies of Martin Luther King Jr.'s um, uh, 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 invocation for us to love the cop that beats us. You know, when you think about hatred and love, they are not on opposite sides, because when a community rises up because out of some kind of a hatred that they feel toward the police, we are now having this conversation a few days before the George Floyd trial will begin. It begins on Monday. We're having this conversation the Friday before. We're watching very closely. We think about justice and things like that, hobbled as they may be, in terms of our ability to extract them from the legal system. But love for a community is fully capable of mobilizing hatred for an enemy. Not every hatred is an opposite of love. Some hatreds are mobilized by love. And I think this is very important because, of course, then we would have to talk about what is meant by hatred, which is not the subject of this book. Although I'm thinking now in a different way that may address that. I'm thinking about this question, what is an enemy? You know, this is maybe the next chapter, if you will, is what is an enemy and what is a hatred. Going back to something you said, Michael, about Fromm, I don't know exactly, you mentioned Escape from Freedom. The last chapter of Escape from Freedom is focused on spontaneity. Right. You know, Fromm's writing about spontaneity in the last chapter of Escape from Freedom. And he's talking to people who are talking also to him about spontaneous. I think spontaneous is not really what's going on in a lot of social upheavals are called spontaneous, which presupposes they almost come from nowhere. But I think that's not accurate. But someone like Raya Dunayevskaya and Herbert Marcuse, they understood a certain spontaneity of the upheaval or unrest, right? And it is particularly striking that that Fromm was, you know, drawn to the SPSDF and David Reisman's kind of brand of liberalism. It may be, as you say, to do with McCarthyism, but we shouldn't forget that Marcuse and Dunayevskaya and many other radicals were living in the United States at the same time and had a better analysis. Right. My view is basically that, well, I mean, Fromm made many mistakes. This was one of them. And if he had fully thought through his theory of love in relation to Black revolt, in relation to women's struggles, not just in the United States, but happening around the world in the 50s and 60s, then the impetus for me to write this book would have been that much lessened. Right. You know, there would still have been other reasons, of course, right. But it's a terrible frustration that that he didn't do that when he could have, despite all the other things going on at the time.
I think you bring up a very good point here about Fromm too, that we should take into account. I mean, of course, the spontaneity, you know, the Luxemburgist moment too, as well. You know, he's, you know, recapturing that in 41 from the 1910s, you know, as we know. The aspect of going towards the social democratic way, to me, is based, and I'm in agreement with Marcuse about this, that there's a neo-revisionist Freud operative here, that there's a de-emphasization on Freud's theories of infantile sexuality, and that there's a kind of almost de-libidinized Freud that's operative between Fromm that translates itself into an assimilationist psychoanalysis. And that's why I brought up somewhat this notion of the McCarthyism, and that Freud sometimes becomes used as a decoy, if you will, or as a prop against any kind of insurgency in the moment. And we saw this a lot in the 60s. I don't know if you remember or if you know Frederick Cruz, but he thought all the student rebellions were Oedipal revolts, right? And he chastised everybody. You're just rebelling against the father, your teachers, et cetera, et cetera. So this comes back in. So I think also in this notion of the and, too, love and hate. You know, one of the great interventions in psychoanalysis was Jean Laplanche's Life and Death in Psychoanalysis. You know, so love and hate are together, love and hate in the community too. We cannot just speak of love itself, right? You know, the way, you know, we have a tendency to get fixated. Love will overcome. It will get us through the night. It's going to take a lot of love to play on popular, you know, culture, et cetera. So anyway, and I want to return just for a second what you said about Simone Weil, which I think is very interesting, your choice of the three figures in the fourth, Jacques Caminet, in the first chapter. You make a point that Simone Weil wanted to transcend, but not abolish. And I think this is very crucial for where we are in capitalism. I think this is a very crucial methodological moment of your work, that the transcendence is operating in writers such as Levinas, and Blanchot, who can see what's going down and very poetically capture it. And of course, Simone Weil, I would retitle Waiting on God, or Waiting on God to Waiting on Love, maybe a good way of looking at this, you know, looking for. But at the same time, these are thinkers of transcendence, not the marks of the community in which you mentioned earlier, the great famous passage in the Grundrisse of the real movement that abolishes, that criticizes. And how do we get there? How do we explain this real movement in the present affair of things? So I think this was another excellent point. The book is so filled. Again, I really wish we had, you know, multiple hours. Maybe we can pick up with this under a thematic where we bring in Bruno's book and maybe a couple of other things together as another kind of prosperity Marxism. You know, we have a meeting of you know, the minds on these themes. But yeah, so Bruno, please.
Yes. Thanks first of all for your remarks on my book, but I completely agree that there is so much, no, in common that we have. I completely agree with what you said, and I want to go back to Simone Weil. I mean, especially in chapter 1, what you were saying about frailty, especially, is so important. And but first say that at the outset of chapter 1, you say something very important and very beautiful. I believe that it's again, I read this book is fundamentally about what to do with a life. Not with life, with a life, which is wonderful, and what a life is for. And that opens the chapter on Simone Weil, I would say, Blanchot, and Levinas. The question of, and then you say in that same chapter, at one point, also speaking about Simone Weil, that the question is to become capable of, right, to see, actually, to be able to see others the way they are, which again, that's a very important moment in the question of, and you go back to that, the question of the relationship, right, with others, which is ultimately communism, is right, in other words, is the being with. I mean, if we really acknowledge the importance of being with others, and that's within oneself too, because even when we are alone, and I like your moments about solitude, right? I mean, you go also into Hannah Arendt's distinction between loneliness and solitude, and you said to be alone, it's fine. You know, it's not necessarily a moment of right. Actually, it can be a good thing, and it does not take away the ability to love and to be with others at the same time, even when you're alone. So, but the frailty. The question.
You said you have a very good point here. I just want to add for Richard too, that Richard really thinks through the being with and the as such, being with and the as such, which you pointed to. He
Yeah,
used
yeah.
the term of the as such, as one is, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah,
the being
indeed. Yeah.
withness is with the as such as well. And this is the insight I think he draws from Simone Weil. But yeah, I just want to add that.
Yeah, no, perfect. I agree with you also, Michael. And the question, therefore, of frailty that includes both now the moment of attention and care, and also goes into the very important problem, generally speaking, throughout history, but in our current moment, particularly of the fiction of independence and the recognition instead of dependence or interdependence at best, right? So it is precisely there that the frailty in the relationship that we establish with others becomes visible, but even with ourselves. I mean, recognizing that a life, as you say, right, what to do with a life which is by its very nature frail, right? And so this is something beautiful, precisely in relation to the discourse that you trace on love. I mean, this is why love is needed in a sense. But again, I go back to what we spoke about before. I mean, love is already there. It is the question of producing. If we may use the word machine, since we are reading Deleuze and Guattari with Michael now, ourselves as machines, desiring machines, but machines of love, capable of loving. And again, when I said before, it's there are some problematic elements, of course, but the problematic aspect of all this is that it is precisely not an easy thing. It's a difficult task, and this is what probably many people want to avoid, and our societies, the capitalist society, allows, and actually, strengthens that illusion that indeed I can be independent, I can be myself, I can also not care, right, about myself, about the others. I can also not love and wait for love, just to take over me and so on and so forth, instead of engaging in this very important ontological, even in the production of oneself as a singularity, right, in the production of this. One has to engage with the awareness of the frailty and the generosity also, of course, right? But this question of frailty that goes back, you also mentioned already the important moment of disability, and also the wonderful later slogan by Marx, right? I mean, but precisely with disability, which is an extreme condition of dependency, but dependency is
Bruno quotes a very beautiful passage of Simone Weil in the beginning. Human existence is so fragile a thing and exposed to such dangers that I cannot love without trembling. It's a very beautiful
right,
passage.
yeah, absolutely.
And
yes.
also, attention is the form most rare, I'm translating from the French, and the most pure of generosity. This is what intention. So this movement of generosity and attention together, which you call care, but she uses the word generosity, more of an Aristotelian kind of concept than the way we use, magnanimity, I think would be part of it.
Yes.
In a certain way. I want to go just for a second. You had something else, please?
No, then I just maybe touch on in this chapter, of course, the importance of the face-to-face moment in Levinas, which goes back to this question of the relationship between the one and the other, or two others, in a sense, right? I mean, because the one is a problem. And then also, in relation to Blanchot, I'd like to maybe later speak about the very beautiful, important distinction between revolt and rebellion that you make, that I like very much. But yeah, I mean, these are some of the points that I would touch on in chapter 1, but especially this question of the dependence, because again, recognizing that changes everything, and immediately maybe the epiphany, right? You say, oh, but love happens, love becomes the secret
Right.
communism becomes manifest because it is already there. Because without the relationship with others, it is not possible really to be. Right. If I may, I know that Michael, maybe you say I should stay with the book, but at
Oh, it's
times,
okay.
no, if I may, no, because there is a
Book has so
concept.
much. So we have a
I know, we have so
lot of
much, but this
exposure.
really
Yeah,
comes, I mean, a concept that I use
yeah.
often.
Why we get
And
outside the Viet Cong into yeah? Why do we want to go further east? I'm just
yeah,
kidding.
okay. No, just to say a concept that I always use, and I use in my book as well,
Right,
Ubuntu, right?
right,
From a Southern African
right,
philosophy.
right,
I am because we are.
yeah,
So otherwise, I would not be.
right, right.
Simply,
Yeah.
yeah. So I
Very,
mean,
very,
that's,
very
yeah.
good. I just want to, yeah, just a couple of things too. I have one thought. I mean, I don't know how you would relate to this, but it seems to me that you mentioned David Reisman and Fromm's relationship. And as you know, David Reisman wrote the book, The Lonely Cloud, right? In which he talks about, which Philip Slatter, by the way, you probably know this, The Pursuit of Loneliness. This was an individualism. It was a kind of extension of Reisman's work. And Reisman was a very prominent sociologist. And maybe one way of thinking about this limited Fromm for thinking again in terms of the collective. He really became part of this almost post-World War II American sociological construct, right? That made everything still the individual responsibility, or really to put it in even Bruno's language, it's a singular responsibility without the concept of interdependency, without the concept of this. And hence we get language in psychology. And I think Bruno's work and your work are both very important in deconstructing this language of contemporary therapeutic practice for the last 20 years. This notion of codependency, it's ridiculous because in a sense, it speaks to this pathology instead of looking at things through the interdependency, right? And Richard, as you say, through a possible community or a secret, community of lovers. There's no, this is what adaptive, behavioral, and cognitive psychology is doing to us. And I think that's the battleground because it's so dominant through the APA, through so many, marketing operations, going back to the poverty of exchange value, how love itself is commodified day in, day out, and then spoken of in these terms that are incredibly, not only reductionistic, but incredibly limiting, almost crippling in terms of us getting anywhere. And this is, to my mind, Reisman's obviously a very intelligent person and a well-known sociologist, but in a way, Marcuse did not have a relationship with him. Fromm did. Adorno did not have a relationship with Reisman. Fromm did, right? So this is a kind of split that maybe it had taken, and how the social sciences were constructed and how they fit into almost a kind of prefiguration of what we have today of there is no alternative, or the prefiguration of a kind of neoliberal dominance, if you will, or late liberal dominance. So I just wanted to bring that up, as something that, you speak to very well in the section on praxis, critical theory, and psychoanalysis. And and that we, could extend. Yeah.
Let me just say a couple of things quickly on some of what's been said. The first one
Yeah.
with Fromm, I do want to be clear, however,
Yeah.
that that Fromm had the the clear commitment
Right.
to try to think of love as an anti-capitalist,
Right.
active relationality, for all of the limitations, for all of the mistakes, perhaps, in Fromm's work, which I highlighted in my presentation here, but also do in the book. I hope that those who read the book will also see that I have a very deep appreciation for this project that he dared to undertake, which is to say that that love relations are antagonistic to capitalist social relations, and it appears in a number of his major works. And I think it's extremely important. And in some ways, the greatest failure is the failure of those within Fromm's circle to really continue to develop that thinking on up to the present. So you can see in Marcuse, Eros and Civilization, you can see some others who took up the concept of Eros, as I mentioned, George Katsiafakis, and there was a book that came out on SUNY Press several years ago that I have an essay in called Spontaneous Combustion, which shows that there are some others thinking about these issues. But there was actually a pretty unfortunate gap in thinking about love as a political concept, or specifically a communist social relation or communist form of life. And what has happened instead is that some of the major sociologists of love, the most significant one of our time is Eva Illouz, who's written many major studies on love. She's the major figure of the sociology of love, is to treat love as the private property of a romantic relationship.
Right.
Unfortunately, we can also see traces of this narrowness in Badiou, in Praise of Love, when Badiou talks about the two scene and very openly resists moving beyond that to some kind of a political theorization of the concept of love. Badiou is working also with Plato, and Badiou is thinking about symposium, because the symposium was a gathering of those to give speeches in praise of love.
Right.
So there's a certain a narrowness that I think Fromm, for all of his faults, tried to wrench apart. And the biggest regret is that it really has been left to commercial efforts to privatize love as something that is available through algorithmic matchmaking services, to think about love as a private property of romantic relations, or as an ineffable anti-political phenomenon. And so really, in some way, I want to say we need more Fromm anyway.
Yeah.
But in terms of this point on dependency, what Bruno is raising, this is really important, I think.
Right.
And Michael, you also pick up on it. It's not just in terms of becoming, it's in terms of, as Bruno said, we wouldn't even exist. So if you read, as of course, we always have to do in philosophy, if you read Locke's chapter on property and the labor theory of property that became in some ways one of the most central building blocks of the philosophy of liberal capitalism, chapter 5 of Property from the Two Treatises of Government. Locke has this idea that you mix your labor with the natural world, and you take it, you take some share of the natural world so that you can survive. You get private property, you convert the common property to private property through mixing your labor with the natural world. He talks about the common. He talks about leaving enough left over for others. And he says, if we had to ask everybody around us if we could take the apples, man would have starved, notwithstanding all the plenty that was left for him.
Right.
So what I think is the great insight that you can find in Marx, in the response to the philosophy of property and liberal capitalism, is that, if I were to take my children and give them a copy of Two Treatises of Government and place them in the woods and say, everything that you need has been provided by God. All you need to do is mix your labor with the field and you can eat, and I'll be back in 20 days to check on you, right? My children would be dead in a day, because what really is happening is not that. What's really happening is this tending to the frailty of the other. Children and adults have different frailties that have to be attended to in love relations of one kind or another. And it's existential, not just in the sense of what it means to be, but it's existential in the sense that we would die without it. So to just transition to some of what I know you wanted to also talk about, Michael, about the pandemic.
Yes.
I mean, you know, there has been a famous phrase that circulated in the last year: "We are in this together." It's in some way it's a liberal proclamation of solidarity. To say we are in this together is to say we are in our separate places, but we are all in this together. It's a certain proclamation of solidarity.
Right.
But what we are is in this together, totally apart. So it's a togetherness that is apart, which is one of the problems that Levinas means to raise by speaking so prominently about the importance of the face to face. I think one of the problems we now confront, that I hope thinking about the communism of love can help us to confront, is that our capitalist societies have in some ways prepared us very well for being together totally apart. We have been prepared, universities
Yes.
have been prepared to continue to function as disembodied brains. You know, Foucault's idea of the body controlled by the brain, but now it's actually the brain is disembodied from the body. So it's a conference of brains. You know, I would rather, I'm very grateful for us doing this, but I'd rather be in New York with you. But we don't need that anymore, because we can bring our brains together without our bodies. We can create a conference of cognitive activity or cognitive relationality that is in some sense disembodied.
What we can't do, Richard, is drink wine at Bruno's place all night tonight. We can bring it together, but we don't have that capacity to be together for 12 hours and really build secret societies and secret,
Right.
you know, yeah, anyway, please.
Or to see if I've retained any of my rhythm of walking from New York, or if I would just be hit by a car on the Boulevard of Death.
Right.
But I mean, you know, I think what we really have, because there's a lot of language of togetherness,
Right.
which is being taken up and circulated in a context of total separation, isolation, and also opposition, not solidarity, but it's opposite. So, so when we think about the communism of love, I suppose one pandemic hope, if I can put it in that terms, one pandemic hope will be that we may finally confront the limits of the liberal discourse on togetherness. You know, because we are in this together, but we are totally apart. And in many countries that cannot stockpile the vaccine, having more vaccine than they have even of population, it's an oppositional relation that emerges between those who can get it and those who can't. And the competitive logic of life, which love is in its best form antagonistic to, the competitive logic of life is killing us.
Mhm.
Okay, we are not figuratively,
Right.
but literally being killed by the competitive logic of life. Who can, who cannot, who can get it, who cannot, who can live without an income, who cannot. For whom is a stimulus check enough? For whom is it not?
Right.
Right? And
Yep.
even from state to state, Some people can get, some people cannot. And we should also think about the materiality of psychological impacts, the the um, the incredible toll that the pandemic and its isolation is is going to have to be studied in terms of the psychosocial dimensions. To see children in middle school, like my oldest son, who is trying to figure out who he is all alone. The emergence of what Bruno calls the singularity within the limited confines of a household is undermined in this passage of history. So I really want to resist discourses on love that are liberal, and those are the ones that dominate the conversation, not just inside of sociological debates, but also outside of those debates in the mainstream political or social or whatever discourse of our society. These liberal discourses of all being in it together while we're totally apart, and not attending to the real frailties of real people in the real world. That's what love does. And at its best, that's the that's the work of the communist Gemeinwesen we need.
Very good. Any comment on that, Bruno? Maybe we can finish with that on the communist, Gemeinwesen.
Yeah.
The
Yeah, I mean, the real community, which of course what comes to mind, one of the most important moments in the Grundrisse. It's all important, explosive in many ways, but it's when in the so-called fragment on the machine, Marx speaks of the real wealth, right? Which is, I mean, no longer money, right? But disposable time to become, right? Time to do something with a life, as you put it. So this real wealth is what perhaps can also lead to a different real community. I had to say, and Michael and I spoke often about this, I have problems with the very idea of community, and I see that you go into that as well by reference to, well, some of the, maybe Harrison as well?
Yes, Peter Harrison.
Yeah, and other times in which you mentioned that, and although I don't like, and I think that you're also critical of his answer work. No, it's not work, but that's right. But certainly the question of the community is, and you mentioned that earlier, just like the family, speaking about also the feminist take on this, it can be a form of capture. And
Yes.
very often is, right? So, I mean, it is problematic in that sense, because it's not either, you know, it's not that easy to say, well, it's not anymore the individual that we had to focus on, but the community. I mean, again, these are those situations in which it is probably neither one nor the other, but the constitution of something new.
I like the a priori that we have discussed to a certain degree today is really the interdependence of all things and of each other, right? I think this is a good working a priori in terms of a discussion about the community, not individual or singularity and universal and those kind of terms. If we began with your term, you know, that you get from Kite, you know, and interdependence, and what Richard is doing here too, vis-a-vis Simone Weil and others in his first chapter and even later in the book too, that this might be a very good starting point to rethink community outside of the, you know, the Blanchoian, Jean-Luc Nancy inoperative community, or the community without ends, again, in Kantian terms. Yeah.
Right,
So,
which, no, if I may, because this leads,
we don't
no,
want
exactly.
to keep our,
No, but it is exactly the concept of trans-individuality, now coined by Gilbert Simondon, which precisely addresses the question of the problem of the reduction to either the individual or the community, right? And what I rename, in a sense, but it's not just a terminological thing, trans-individuality, because I want to get rid of the individual altogether in the subject. But it is this moment, this assemblage, which is also virtual today, because you were speaking, and I like what you said, Richard, about the question today with the pandemic and so on. However, and I don't want now to go into the question of technology. We did that last week with my book also, right? But certainly, as you were saying, there was preparation, the universities and so on and so forth. However, I mean, I see for myself, I live in a cloud between Brooklyn and Calabria, and maybe other clouds too. But the fact that I can speak to my twin brother every night, actually this time you said we speak, you know, and it is as if I were there, he were here, but it is not a fictitious as if. It is a virtual, but it is real at the same time, insofar as virtual reality is also reality. And our epiphany right now, not our event, our shows that, right, that we are here speaking about in almost, you know, as close a situation as possible, right, to the end.
But let me just make one quick point to that, and then I know we've been going a long time, but I agree with you, Bruno, because I have myself reconnected with some real friends that I had fallen out of touch with for many years. And we also have regular meetings. And I totally resist the idea that that friendship is not real because it's through a screen. It is absolutely real. And it has enriched my life very substantially. I wouldn't trade it for anything, and I hope it lasts forever. But the point that I would make, it's not a typical critique of technology from the dialectic of enlightenment. But the point I would make is ultimately a point about political economy and about Marx, which is that the reality of your meeting or our meeting this way is one of the great pleasures of my sabbatical this semester, is meeting you this way. And Michael, I'm very grateful, and I mean it to the bone marrow. But when we think politics, we have to think about structural transformations of the world beyond the screen, which is not to say it's either or, but the concept of the Gemeinwesen, which Marx, you could say, radicalized from Hegel, right? And thinking about capitalist social relations and so forth, was ultimately about the structural transformation of the world as we know it. The structural transformation of the world as we know it, including its laws, including the way that we relate to our work, the way that we relate to other people around us. You know, Kollontai, she didn't want to just, you know, when she thought about the family, she thought about radically restructuring the way that we think about children so that they're not just the private property of two individuals. So I am not making a kind of simple rejection of this relationship that we can maintain through the screen. It is wonderful, in fact, and I cherish it in my own life. But we mustn't lose sight of the necessity. Capital would like nothing better than for us to relocate all of our activities into these screen relations. Capital would be perfectly safeguarded by the transposition of our shared political commitments to these metatopical spaces.
And believe me, Capital is ready to commodify nostalgia, that they're working day and night on Madison Avenue. How are we going to commodify Richard Gilman Kolpowski's, you know, nostalgia for his old friendships? How are we going to play this out in the new advertising sequences, etc.? So we have to be really on guard here, as well as in the university, even more so. Yes, please.
That's why, Richard, if you were in New York, you would see that we, the three of us and others, go out of our way to see each other as often as we can face to face.
Luckily, I'm in the center. I'm the best location, so I have to go to the lead. But I'm the oldest. I use a age privilege in that regard. Yeah. Anyway, it was a pleasure to meet you, really. Finally, in my case, and a pleasure to hear you about that. I think it's a very, very, very important book. I would like to do this again, probably in the next couple of months. We don't want to be redundant, but maybe early summer, late May, early June, if people are available, we can maybe put together something a little more thematically on you and Bruno's work, and maybe something else, and we'll rejoin and reconnect on that basis. But let's of course stay in touch. And I'm going to sign off. We can stay on, but anyway, I want to thank. Yeah, what are we going to say, Bruno?
No, I also need to go because Nino.
Yes, I understand. So thank you, everybody. This is.
But yeah, it was really great. Thank you,
Prosperity
Richard. Thank you,
Marxism.
everybody. Thank
I
you,
thank my
Michael, Klaus.
co-host Bruno Gulli and our special guest Richard Gilman Opalski, and our executive producer, as usual, Joshua Calvo, who today is going to be, probably not much work to cut and edit this one. It was very good, very flowing. I hope it's not a task. So thank you again, Richard, and we'll see you hopefully in a couple of months, definitely, for another show. And thank you to the audience for being with us. I think there are many, many ideas here, much to chew on and much to work with. And let's start working on the community of love. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you
So much.
There is a war between the rich and poor, a war between the man and the woman. There is a war between the ones who say there is a war and the ones who say that there isn't. Why don't you come on back to the war? That's right, get in it. Why don't you come on back to the war? It's just beginning.